James Carter had always known that land was more than just dirt and grass. It was a legacy, a piece of his family's heart. His 1,500 acres were a part of his history, passed down from his great-grandfather, who had bought the land decades ago. For James, the land wasn't just about farming or business. It was about remembering his roots and keeping his family's story alive. Every inch of it had a memory, his father teaching him how to work the land, the time he built his first home, and the way his mother would sit on the porch, watching the sunset with a peaceful smile on her face. As James grew older, his connection to the land only grew stronger. He had worked hard to improve it, turning a small, struggling farm into a thriving business. He had big plans for the future. James wanted to expand, build new homes for his growing family, and even create a community that could flourish on the land his ancestors had fought to keep. But something began to feel wrong. The trouble started quietly at first. James had noticed that members of the local homeowners association, HOA, were becoming more active. They began sending letters, asking about zoning permits and suggesting changes to the area. James didn't pay much attention at first. He was busy with his business, but as the weeks went on, their presence became harder to ignore. They started showing up at town meetings, pushing for changes to the surrounding areas, and making vague promises about community growth. The messages were filled with promises of modernization and increased property values. To James, it seemed too good to be true. Then, one afternoon, James received a letter from the HOA. It was a simple piece of paper, but the words on it shocked him. The letter stated that his property had been mistakenly listed as part of a larger plot of land that the HOA had purchased. The land, they claimed, was being transferred to a developer for new residential projects. They suggested that James could discuss compensation for the inconvenience. James's heart sank. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was an attempt to take his land away from him. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He had always paid attention to his property deeds, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when he dug deeper, he found something troubling. His land, his family's land, had been sold without his consent. The HOA had used a combination of legal tricks, paperwork errors, and forged signatures to transfer ownership of James' 1,500 acres to a real estate company. They had taken advantage of his absence at some of the town meetings and used his lack of knowledge about certain legal procedures to slip their actions under the radar. The land James had worked on for years, the land his ancestors had cared for, was being taken from him as if it were just another piece of property to be sold. James felt the weight of the injustice crash over him. He had spent his entire life building something he could be proud of, and now it was being stolen by people who saw it as nothing more than an opportunity for profit. Anger flared inside him. He couldn't let this happen. This wasn't just about the land. It was about his family's legacy. It was about fighting for what was right. He immediately reached out to a lawyer, a man named Marcus Reynolds, who had helped him with some business contracts in the past. Marcus was a sharp, no-nonsense kind of guy. James explained the situation, and Marcus was just as shocked as he was. He promised to help and assured James that they would fight the HOA with everything they had. "They might think they can get away with this," Marcus said, "but they've underestimated you." The fight against the HOA would be long and difficult, but James knew he couldn't give up. He called a meeting with his lawyer and began gathering every piece of evidence he could find. He had old property deeds, records of his payments, and even photos of the land from years ago. But he needed more. He needed to prove that the HOA's actions were not just a mistake, they were part of a much larger scheme to take land from black families. As the weeks passed, James and Marcus dug deeper into the HOA's history. What they discovered shocked them both. The HOA, it turned out, had been involved in other shady land deals. They had targeted other property owners in the area, especially those who were minorities or didn't have the resources to fight back. The pattern was clear: they were buying land for cheap, using questionable legal tactics, and flipping it for profit. James couldn't believe what he was learning. The people behind the HOA were not just corrupt, they were taking advantage of people like him, people who had worked hard to build something only to see it stolen from them. It was personal now. James wasn't just fighting for his land, he was fighting for every black family who had been wronged in the past. Determined to take the fight to court, James and Marcus gathered their evidence and prepared to face the HOA in front of a judge. The legal battle was about to begin, and James knew it wouldn't be easy. The HOA had money, power, and influence. But he had something they didn't: the truth. The day of the first court hearing arrived. James felt a mix of nerves and resolve as he walked into the courthouse. He wasn't just representing himself, he was representing his ancestors, his community, and everyone who had ever been wronged by those who thought they could steal from the less fortunate. The room was filled with tension as James sat down in front of the judge. He glanced over at the HOA representatives, who sat with smug expressions, thinking they had already won. But James was ready. He wasn't going to let them take his land. Not without a fight. As the legal battle began, James felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew this fight was far from over, but he wasn't going to back down. The more he learned about the HOA's actions, the more he realized just how deep their corruption ran. They didn't just target him, they had a history of exploiting other landowners, especially those who didn't have the resources to stand up for themselves. James spent the next few weeks meeting with his lawyer, Marcus, and going over every bit of evidence they could find. They reviewed the documents that the HOA had filed to transfer his land, and Marcus pointed out several inconsistencies and errors that should have been enough to disqualify their claim. There were signatures that didn't match, dates that didn't line up, and legal procedures that had been ignored. It was clear, the HOA had taken illegal steps to steal James' land. But there was a problem. The HOA had a powerful network of lawyers, and they weren't going to give up easily. James knew this would be a long and tough fight. He wasn't just fighting for his land, he was fighting for his reputation, his family's history, and his dignity. The moment the HOA saw him as a threat, they started to make things difficult. They began filing motions to delay the case, dragging it on for months. The longer it took, the more they thought they could wear him down. But James wasn't the kind of man to quit. He knew that time was on his side. The longer the case went on, the more the public would learn about the HOA's actions. He started talking to reporters, sharing his story with local news stations. The more people heard about the illegal land grab, the more support James got. Soon, his case became a symbol of resistance, especially in the black community, where stories of land theft and corruption were all too familiar. Every day, James went to work on his land, tending to the crops and the animals as if nothing had changed. But his mind was constantly focused on the battle ahead. He thought about his family and the generations before him who had worked hard to make this land thrive. They had struggled, faced hardship, and persevered. He wasn't about to let all that history slip away because of a few corrupt individuals looking to make a quick profit. As the case continued, the tension between James and the HOA grew. The homeowners who had supported the HOA in the past began to question the organization's motives. They'd seen how James had always been a good neighbor, someone who helped the community and treated everyone with respect. They'd never imagined he would be caught up in a legal fight like this. Many began to speak out, telling James they had been misled by the HOA. Some even joined him in his fight, offering to testify about what they had seen and heard. But the HOA wasn't about to give up that easily. They had deep pockets, and they knew how to play the legal game. They fought back with everything they had, trying to use their power to intimidate James into giving up. They made him offers, trying to buy him out, but James refused every time. His land wasn't for sale. Not to them. One evening, as James sat in his office, going through stacks of papers with Marcus, he realized just how much was at stake. This wasn't just about the land, it was about something much bigger. If the HOA got away with this, it wouldn't be the last time they tried to steal from someone like him. He could see the pattern. They were targeting vulnerable people, especially those who didn't have the means to fight back. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. The fight began to take a toll on James, though. His days were filled with meetings, court appearances, and long hours of paperwork. There were days when it felt like everything was falling apart. He had trouble sleeping, his mind racing with thoughts of the case. Sometimes, it seemed like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. But every time he felt like giving up, he would remember why he was fighting. One night, while James was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, he thought back to the day he first set foot on his land. He remembered how his great-grandfather had looked at the land, how his father had worked it, and how, as a young boy, James had dreamed of one day expanding it. This land was more than just property, it was part of who he was. It was part of his identity. And no one was going to take it from him. The next morning, James woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He called Marcus and told him that they needed to step up their efforts. The HOA had underestimated him, but now it was time to show them just how serious he was. He wasn't just going to fight in the courtroom, he was going to expose them for what they truly were. James reached out to several civil rights groups and asked for their support. They had been fighting against land theft and property discrimination for years, and they knew exactly how to handle the HOA's tactics. With their help, James gained even more allies. His story started to spread far beyond the local news. People across the country were rooting for him, and he could feel the power of that support pushing him forward. The next court date arrived, and James walked into the courtroom with his head held high. He wasn't just there for himself, he was there for every person who had ever been cheated out of their property. The judge could see the determination in his eyes. James wasn't going to back down. He had fought for this land, and he was going to continue fighting, no matter what. As the case continued, the pressure on the HOA started to mount. They had underestimated James, and now they were paying the price. Their corruption was beginning to come to light, and the public was beginning to turn against them. James had already won a few small victories, but he knew the real battle was still ahead. The HOA had a lot of resources, and they weren't going to give up without a fight. But James had something they didn't, he had the truth on his side. As the months passed, James continued to face pressure from the HOA, but his determination never wavered. His lawyer, Marcus, had been working around the clock, sifting through mountains of documents and evidence. They had already uncovered the fraud that had been committed to steal his land, but James knew the fight wasn't over. The HOA had a lot of resources and influence, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. But he wasn't backing down. James knew that he couldn't just rely on the court to win this fight. He had to do more. He began reaching out to other landowners in the area, asking them about their experiences with the HOA. As he dug deeper, he realized just how widespread the problem was. The HOA had been using its power to push through questionable property deals and had taken advantage of people who didn't have the means to fight back. Many of these landowners had been targeted because they were either older, minority groups, or simply didn't have the legal knowledge to understand what was happening to them. James knew he wasn't the only one. His land was just one piece in a much larger puzzle. As he spoke to other victims, he heard heartbreaking stories of families losing their homes, businesses being threatened, and people being pushed out of their communities. This was not just about his fight, it was about standing up for everyone who had been hurt by the same corrupt system. In one meeting, James sat with a group of homeowners who had been victims of the HOA's manipulation. An older woman, Mrs. Thompson, explained how the HOA had threatened to increase her property taxes unless she sold her land to one of their connected developers. She wasn't alone. Other families in the room shared similar stories. James listened intently, his heart heavy with anger and frustration. The HOA's actions had not just affected him, it had hurt so many others as well. James realized that the only way to truly defeat the HOA was to show the world what they had been doing. If he could expose their tactics, he could not only protect his land but also help others who were suffering in silence. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. One day, while reviewing the case in his office, Marcus brought up an idea that would change the course of the battle. He suggested using the same legal loopholes the HOA had used to steal his land, but this time, they would target the homes of the HOA's leaders. Marcus had been researching the deeds and discovered that several members of the HOA had properties that were acquired in ways that were just as questionable as the land deal that had stolen James' farm. The idea was simple: if they could prove that these members had gained their properties under false pretenses, they could seize those homes, just as the HOA had tried to do with his land. At first, James was hesitant. It felt like retaliation, and he didn't want to stoop to their level. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The HOA had abused the system, and now they were going to pay the price. If James could use the law against them, it would send a powerful message: the corrupt couldn't just take from the hardworking and get away with it. James and Marcus worked together to compile all the evidence they needed. They tracked down the deeds of the HOA members and found enough discrepancies to build a solid case. These were the same people who had plotted to take James' land. Now, they were going to feel the same pressure that James had endured. As the news of their legal plans spread, more and more people began to rally behind James. The community, once divided, was now united. People who had been hesitant to speak out now found the courage to come forward. They had watched for too long as the HOA took advantage of their neighbors. They knew it was time to stand up. James' plan to go after the HOA's leaders' homes began to take shape. With his legal team working overtime, they prepared to present their case. They knew it wouldn't be easy. The HOA would fight back hard, and they had money on their side. But James had something they didn't: the support of the community and the truth. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all the people who had been hurt by the same corrupt system. As the legal documents were filed and the case moved forward, James found himself becoming a symbol of justice. His name was in the newspapers, his story was on the local news, and people were talking about him. He had become the face of resistance. The fight for his land had turned into something much bigger: it was a fight for the rights of all landowners, especially those who had been wronged by the system. In the midst of the legal battle, James took a step back one evening and stood on the land his great-grandfather had worked so hard to build. He looked out over the fields, the crops growing strong and steady, the trees that had been there for generations. The wind rustled through the leaves, and for a moment, he felt the presence of his ancestors. They had fought hard to keep this land, and now, it was his turn to do the same. He wasn't going to let them down. As the court date approached, the pressure mounted. The HOA began to realize that they were losing control. Their lawyers tried every trick in the book to delay the proceedings, but James and Marcus were ready. They had the truth on their side, and the evidence was undeniable. One afternoon, as the legal team prepared for the next round of hearings, Marcus received an unexpected call. The HOA had made an offer: they wanted to settle. They offered James a large sum of money in exchange for him dropping the case and walking away. It was tempting. The money would solve many problems, and it would end the fight once and for all. But James knew what this was: an attempt to buy his silence. He turned them down without hesitation. He didn't want their money. He wanted justice. And he wasn't about to back down now. The day of the next court hearing arrived, and James was ready. He had been fighting this battle for months now, and he knew that this would be the day that would decide everything. He had prepared himself, his lawyer Marcus had prepared the case, and the entire community was behind him. The air felt heavy with anticipation as James walked into the courtroom. His steps were steady, his head held high. He knew that this fight was far from just about land. It was about showing that justice could prevail, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. The courtroom was filled with people. The HOA's lawyers were sitting at their table, looking confident, as always. James couldn't help but notice how they still seemed to underestimate him. They thought they could use their power and money to win, but James wasn't like the others they had targeted. He wasn't going to back down. The judge entered the room, and the proceedings began. Marcus started by laying out the facts: the illegal sale of James' land, the forged signatures, and the discrepancies in the property deeds. He spoke with confidence, knowing they had the truth on their side. He called the HOA's actions what they were: fraud. But the HOA's lawyers were ready. They attempted to twist the facts, to confuse the issue and delay the proceedings. They made counterarguments, claiming that James had misunderstood the legal processes, that his land had been mistakenly sold. They pushed for the case to be dismissed, trying to use technicalities to weasel out of their responsibility. They even tried to intimidate James with legal jargon and threats, hoping he would back down. But they didn't realize the strength he had gained over the past few months. James sat quietly, his mind sharp and focused. He knew what they were trying to do. They were hoping he would get frustrated or scared, that he would give up. But James wasn't easily intimidated. He had spent too many years working for what was rightfully his. He had built his life on the values of honesty, hard work, and perseverance. He wasn't going to let these people take that from him. Not without a fight. When it was his turn to speak, James stood up. His voice was calm, but firm. He spoke about his family's history, the legacy that had been passed down from generation to generation. He told the court about his great-grandfather, who had bought the land with his hard-earned money and his own two hands. He spoke of the sacrifices his ancestors had made to keep the land in the family. And he spoke of the pain he felt when he learned that the HOA had tried to steal it from him. The courtroom was silent as James spoke. His words resonated with everyone who was listening. This wasn't just about land, it was about respect, justice, and the rights of people who had been treated unfairly for too long. The HOA may have thought they could control everything, but James was showing them that they couldn't control the truth. As James finished his statement, he looked toward the judge, who was watching him closely. For the first time in the case, James saw something in the judge's eyes: recognition. The judge saw the determination in James's face, and he knew that this was more than just a simple property dispute. It was a battle for something much bigger than that. The HOA's lawyers tried to respond, but it was clear that they were struggling to come up with anything convincing. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the shady dealings, the lack of transparency, it was all there, laid out for everyone to see. And then, as if to add the final blow, Marcus presented the evidence James had uncovered: the illegal deals that several HOA members had made to acquire their own properties. James had used the same legal loopholes the HOA had relied on to steal his land, and now their homes were at risk. It was a powerful message, one that showed just how corrupt the entire system had been. As the proceedings continued, it became clear that the HOA was losing its grip. The judge took note of everything presented and began to ask more questions. He wasn't just taking their word for it anymore. He was looking closely at the facts, and the facts told a clear story of greed, corruption, and fraud. James felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just about him anymore, this was about holding people accountable for their actions. He wasn't the only one who had been wronged, there were others, too. And James knew that if he could win this fight, it would send a message that would resonate far beyond this courtroom. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge finally called for a break. Everyone stood, stretching their legs and gathering their thoughts. James went outside to get some fresh air. He walked around the courthouse grounds, trying to steady his nerves. The weight of the case was heavy, but he knew he couldn't let up. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. As James walked back inside, he saw the faces of the HOA members. They looked frustrated, angry, and worried. They knew the tide was turning. They had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. Their once certain victory was slipping through their fingers. And James wasn't going to let them take it back. When the break was over, the judge returned to the bench. He called for the final arguments. Marcus made his closing statement, summarizing everything they had uncovered and explaining how the HOA's actions were not only illegal but immoral. James stood again, his heart racing, and he spoke one last time. This time, his voice was filled with conviction. He wasn't just asking for his land back, he was asking for justice, for the truth to be acknowledged, and for the corruption to be stopped. The judge listened carefully and then declared that he would take the case under advisement. James held his breath as the judge left the room. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, James felt a glimmer of hope. The evidence was clear. The truth was on his side. And no matter what happened next, he knew that he had done everything he could to fight for what was right. The days following the court hearing were some of the longest James had ever endured. He spent countless hours on his land, walking through the fields, thinking about everything he had gone through. The long months of preparation, the emotional toll, the uncertainty, all of it had led up to this one moment. The judge had said he would take time to review the case, but James couldn't help feeling the weight of it all. Every inch of his land, every moment he had spent working to preserve it, now depended on the decision of one person. Marcus had reassured him. "The evidence is on your side," he'd said, over and over again. "The truth is clear." But James couldn't stop worrying. What if the judge didn't see it the way they did? What if the powerful HOA used their influence to turn things around? James had fought for what was right, but now it felt like he was waiting for the final test. The phone call came on a crisp Tuesday morning. It was Marcus. His voice sounded calm, but there was something else in it, a certain excitement James couldn't quite place. "The judge has made his decision," Marcus said. "He ruled in your favor." James felt a rush of relief wash over him. His heart raced as he listened to Marcus go over the details. The judge had not only ruled that the HOA's actions were illegal, but he had also ordered that James' land be returned to him. The judge had also called for an investigation into the HOA's other dealings, making it clear that this case would not be the end. The corruption would be exposed, and the people behind it would be held accountable. James could hardly believe it. After months of fighting, of sleepless nights, it had finally paid off. His land, his family's legacy, would remain his. The battle wasn't over, but this was a victory. The weight that had been pressing on his chest seemed to lift, and for the first time in a long while, James felt at peace. The news spread quickly, and soon people were calling to congratulate him. His neighbors, his friends, even strangers who had followed his story, reached out with messages of support. James had become a symbol of perseverance, of fighting back against corruption, and people were inspired by his determination. But as much as he appreciated the congratulations, James knew that the real work was just beginning. The court ruling was a victory, yes, but there was still the matter of holding the HOA accountable. The judge had ordered an investigation, but James wasn't about to sit back and wait for things to unfold on their own. He knew that this fight would require more than just legal action, it would take a movement. James began working with local community leaders and activists to ensure that the voices of those who had been hurt by the HOA's actions were heard. He held meetings, spoke to the media, and organized a rally. People who had been afraid to speak out now found the courage to come forward. They shared their stories of being manipulated and pressured into selling their land, of how the HOA had used their power to bully and threaten them. These were stories that had been hidden for far too long. One afternoon, as James sat in a meeting with other community leaders, he realized just how much had changed. The community that had once been divided was now united. People were coming together to support each other, to stand up against the kind of injustice they had experienced. James felt proud to be part of this movement, but he knew that it was bigger than him. This was about more than just one man and one piece of land. It was about creating a future where people's rights were respected, no matter who they were or where they came from. The investigation into the HOA began, and it didn't take long for more evidence of their corruption to surface. It turned out that James wasn't the only one they had targeted. Dozens of other landowners had been cheated out of their property over the years. The more the authorities dug, the more they uncovered. The HOA members were not just involved in fraudulent land deals, they had been profiting from illegal property sales for years. And now, with James at the forefront of the fight, the truth was coming to light. The legal process was slow, but James didn't mind. He had learned patience throughout this ordeal. He continued to fight, not just for his land but for the land of everyone who had been wronged by the HOA. The community, inspired by his actions, began to push for stronger protections for homeowners and landowners. James worked with local lawmakers to draft new legislation that would prevent such corruption from happening again. In the months that followed, James's life slowly began to return to normal, though it was a new kind of normal. His land was back in his hands, but the fight had changed him. He had learned that sometimes the road to justice wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. But it was always worth it. And now, his family's land would remain in their hands for generations to come. One evening, as James stood on the porch of his home, looking out over the land that had been his great-grandfather's, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the fields. The land, once threatened, now felt like a place of victory and peace. James thought about his ancestors, about all the people who had fought for their rights before him, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. But for now, James could breathe easier, knowing that he had stood up when it mattered most. He had fought for what was right, and in doing so, he had not only reclaimed his land but had also sparked a movement that would change the community for the better. He wasn't just a man who had won a legal battle. He was a man who had given people the courage to fight back, to stand up for what they believed in, and to never let injustice go unchallenged. And for James, that was the true victory.